Morning. I'm just kind of getting geared up here to do some work on the homestead today. I've been cleaning up a lot and finding old stuff. Here's 3 anvils I want to talk about. These provide some talking points that I think are important. The most relevant one is about anvil edges and how they get damaged like this and whether they need to be fixed or not. So I have 3 anvils of varying qualities here. This is a very high quality. This is my good anvil. It's a Peter Wright, nice old anvil. This I think is a Vulcan. It looks like it's probably, you know, a decent grade of farrier's anvil for horseshoeing. And this is a crappy cast anvil, the kind of thing you'd find at, say, Harbor Freight for really cheap or something like that. Now, the surface of an anvil should be hard. If you were to clean the rust off of this and everything, you would find that surface to be pretty much intact with no cuts or anything like that. That's because, well, first of all, I take care of it. But the surface of this is so hard that you're just as likely to damage your tool as the surface of the anvil. This one actually does have some damage, and I'll explain why in a minute. But both of these, at least this one for sure, you can see there's a metal plate here. So this top surface is actually a separate piece of metal, and it's more like tool steel, and the rest of this is probably, I don't know what, mild steel, or in the old days I think they used to be wrought iron. That's probably the case with this anvil too, but I'm not sure exactly how the Peter Wrights are constructed. This one is cast, and it looks like it has a separate plate. You can see that, but I think that's just the casting. You can see a seam right here where the anvil was cast in sand. You can see cut marks all over here where someone was probably using it for, you know, with a cold chisel over and over. There's cut marks all up in here. But the interesting thing about this one is it's both broken and cut. So there's a big conchoidal fracture here. That's the type of fracture you get like when you're making stone tools. If you're flaking off flakes of sharp stone to use, you get this kind of a fracture. These are big, ugly, chunky chips, and you can see the metal underneath is jagged and grainy. That indicates that basically this anvil is both brittle and soft enough to cut. Now, with an anvil like these, you'd expect it to be one or the other. Either it's going to be soft and it's going to deform, like this is starting to mushroom out right here, or it's going to be too hard to deform, but it will chip, which is how this used to be. So what happened with this one was that the horn was busted off when I got it. I got it really cheap, I don't remember, maybe 20 bucks or something. And the horn was busted off, and I had a friend re-weld it. He probably had welded this up without taking any precautions of any kind and overheated this surface. Basically, suffice to say that if you have a hard-faced anvil and you get this surface too hot, it becomes soft, and that's what happened with this. So now this has a bunch of cut marks because I stupidly lent it out, and you know, who knows who was using it for what, but this is all bashed up and starting to mushroom and deform. This is mushrooming over this way, and there's cut marks on it where someone was using a chisel, which you just don't do. Like, don't use this surface with a chisel to cut like that. Okay, so let's talk about these edges now, because it's almost ubiquitous to find anvils that have been used very much, especially these old shop anvils. You know, the edges are going to be chipped and rounded to some extent. When they come from the factory, they're usually pretty square. And then, you know, just missed hammer blows, or especially if the work is cold, someone's like working with something cold. Like, I think this was probably a professional farrier's anvil, so it lived on the back of a trailer or a truck, and it was used to, you know, bend horseshoes and shape horseshoes. And the horseshoes are probably cold a lot of the time, and you're just like making small adjustments, and that would be very likely to cause this severe damage on the edges. So on this one, like the worst spots, if I were to round this off, it's probably a 3/4 inch or better radius. But this isn't always a huge problem, and my advice, which I'm going to repeat, is to start working and stop worrying and see if it becomes a problem. If you're looking at used anvils and you have like a 1/4 inch radius, kind of like this, or 3/8 inch radius, that's not really much of anything to worry about. So when I first got this anvil, it's rounded off now, but it was just chipped all up and down here, and I was like, wow, what a nice anvil, but it's kind of a bummer that it's chipped up like that. I've been using friends' equipment and shops. I was just getting my own equipment. And I talked to some guy, and he's like, yeah, you could build that up with welding rod, and told me about that. And then I was reading this cool book. It's a big, thick, old book. It's from either like the late 1800s or the turn of the century. So in there, he says if you get a new anvil and the edges are square, round them off. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting, right? And he gives this whole rationale where he's just like, look, why do you need a square edge? It just leaves marks on your work, and there's no good reason to actually have it. Like, what are you actually going to use a sharp edge on an anvil for? I was like, okay, well, it's already chipped up, so I'm just going to take a grinder, and I think it looks like on this area right here, from about here to here, I just took a flap sander or an angle grinder or something, and I just like made this into a nice radius instead of a bunch of chipped up stuff. And that way it's actually useful. You can like use it to bend radiuses on work. Okay, so I was like, all right, and I was sold on the idea, and that's what I did. I just started working, and I was like, yeah, right, this is never a problem. I mean, it's just never, ever a problem. And if it is, this area usually stays intact because no one works excessively down here because it's fragile, right? You have this tail where it's cut away, and you have holes here which make it even weaker, and you just don't use this for general work very much. So if you need something that's a real small radius or even sharp, then it's usually available back here. So I was convinced, and it worked for me. And then I went to my friend's shop, and he's like, hey, look, I got my new anvil. And he had this anvil shipped, I think it was maybe Swiss or Austrian, a really nice European anvil with the horn type of a tail, where the tail is more like a triangle. Super nice, you know, brand new anvil, and it was really expensive to buy. It was really expensive to ship, you know. And I started working, and I just got really frustrated because it was leaving little pecker tracks all over my work, because every time you hit anywhere remotely near the edge of the anvil, that sharp edge cuts into your work and it leaves like a nick, right? So if this is rounded, it might just leave like a little kind of divot or rounded spot. But this was actually like kind of nicking the work. And I was like, yeah, this is really nice, but you should round those edges off. They're not useful, they're actually a problem. And there's another reason they're a problem, and I'll get to that in a minute. But he was not ready to do that because he just got this anvil. It was probably like, you know, $1,500 or something to get this thing shipped over. But then I saw him like a year later or something, and he said, oh yeah, I rounded those edges off, you were right. Because it's true, they're just a pain in the butt. So here's the other thing. And I know this mostly from flint knapping, but for other reasons too. If you have a really sharp square edge, it's actually more likely to chip too. So the more I take this and radius it off, the more durable it is. If I leave this as a perfectly sharp 90-degree angle and hit it right here on the edge with a hammer, you know, the more square it is, the more the likelihood is that it's going to actually chip off. So ironically, by pre-rounding it a little bit, you could prevent some of this damage. So here's another thing. If you look around at used anvils, you're going to see this, just like I said, it's almost ubiquitous. My friend found this really nice Trenton anvil that was pretty square on the edges, but it's very uncommon. I've never seen one that was that someone bothered to take the time to even round this off more. And these are all working anvils, and people were using them, and it just isn't a problem, is what I'm trying to say. Like, when is this going to be a problem? Think about it. And like I said, stop worrying, start working, and see if it ever becomes a problem. If I got a brand new Peter Wright like this in a barn that basically had never been used, and it had perfectly square edges, well, if it had perfectly square edges and it looked like it was never used, I would sell it and then buy a bigger nice anvil and just sell that as like a collector's item to someone who cares more about the condition of a tool than actually using it. But if I were to keep it for any reason, one of the first things I would do is to take that sharp edge and round it off to an extent. Now I suspect that the best thing to do would actually be take it and maybe make up to a 3/8 inch radius here, and then slowly taper that back to very, very little radius back here, like just kind of round it off. Because again, you don't work back here very much. So this area is pretty safe. Like this is chip, 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 chip right to there. Like that. This one's chipped right to here. And that way you would have this continuously varying radius, and you could pick any spot on that to make bends of different radiuses whenever you wanted. Also, that would leave the part of the anvil that you use the most up here the most protected, because again, the more rounded it is, the less likely you are to get these chips in the first place. But honestly, the chips just don't matter that much. They're not going to interfere with your work very much. I do like the idea of taking and making this radius. If it's already chipped up, you know, why not? Just and I don't know why I didn't do that from here to here, but when I get my shop set back up, I'm going to do that. You can build this up with welding rod. People do it. I wouldn't do it. Like, I wouldn't even do it to this one where the face is significantly narrowed, because there's still enough room here to work, and it's not going to likely to actually get any worse than it is right now. With this anvil, I'll probably retemper it. And you have to wonder, I mean, since you're heating it really, really hot while you're welding, that heat is going to creep in here to some extent and soften at least part of the surface. If nothing else, like right at the joint between the welding and the face right here. And I just would not want to go there personally. I know people do it, but I don't know how much they've used their anvils hard after that. You know, if I did that and it caused maybe a really minor problem of softening here, I might never see it, because I consider myself kind of like the farm blacksmith level, where I just have the stuff and if I need it, I use it. But you know, this is an heirloom tool plus. It could, you know, it's generations worth of use. So who knows who's going to use it in the future for what? And just to mess with that to fix this little bit of, no way, no way. So think twice about getting in there with some heat and messing with this. And if you're looking at anvils, yeah, I mean, if it's this bashed up, this has chips all the way into here on, you know, two sides. So that makes the face only about 2 inches wide here. You know, bargain to get that thing cheap, but you'll find that it's not going to affect you that much. Now, I've also seen pictures and movies of blacksmiths using really bashed up anvils, surfaces, like, you know, things that aren't even hardened. They're soft metal and they're totally dished out, you know, from just abundant use and bashed up in all kinds of ways. And they're still doing work on them. You know, don't get obsessed with like having this perfect equipment. Primitive smiths, the ones that actually had to smelt their own metal. So we're talking about like the smith would go gather minerals and shells for flux, and, you know, build up a pit and basically make small amounts of metal at a time. Or sometimes the furnaces were a little bigger, but they often weren't very big. I mean, that stuff is really precious. So how do you even accumulate enough of that as a poor blacksmith doing this, you know, process from scratch to even make anything resembling an anvil, or often even any large hammers? And those guys actually used stones. They use stones for anvils, and they use stones for big hammers. I have an old video somewhere of some African smiths, and they do the smelting, and then they have a big, one guy has like a big cobble or like a small boulder, and he's the sledge guy. I think they were working on a rock too. So yeah, don't get caught up in that gear thing. Again, it's just skills over gear, and don't get the idea that you can't start doing this without accumulating a bunch of gear. You don't need an anvil to get started blacksmithing. You don't need hardly anything. You need forced air. So, you know, if you're doing small work, you can blow through a tube. It's gonna, you know, you're gonna get dizzy. Find a kid to do it for you. You know, borrow your wife's hair dryer. Raft and mattress pumps. You find those at thrift stores all the time, like the air mattress pumps. You could use those. A lot of them are actually double action too, so they'll blow air when you push on them and when you pull on them. Little squirrel cage fans. What about computer fans? Those things are everywhere. Those little like 12 and 120 volt fans. Those things are everywhere. And if you have a tube, you hook it up to some kind of tube and then just have a gate, like a little piece of sheet metal or something that closes that off, and you can adjust it to like little air through or a lot of air through, and you just put that gate in there. Then you have control over how much air you're letting in. You need tongs. You could use a pair of pliers, although it will ruin the temper. And you need a cold chisel and a hammer and a surface to work on. Like I said, that could even be a rock. You probably can find like a big sledgehammer head, or just, I have various chunks of metal I've collected over the years. There's one right there. It's like, you know, this square and 2 inches thick. That's, you know, adequate to get started. Just start. Dig a hole in the ground, set something up with a, you know, piece of metal pipe and a vacuum cleaner hose and some duct tape, and start working. And get stuff hot and hit it. What I don't want to see is I don't want to see people getting anvils like this, which this is just not a, this damage is not a problem, and getting in there and starting to fix it when it's not necessary. And you know, there's got to be some risk of heating that, and the welding rod you're putting on is not the same as the, you know, as this face. And at the very least, you're going to have to get some kind of detempering of the anvil surface at this joint right here, even if this mass is big enough to soak up most of the heat and not overheat the whole thing. Now this is different because he was just probably sitting here forever building this up with rod and just getting this whole thing super hot. All right, just real quick, I want to show you this. This is a Pygmy Anvil, and it just goes in the ground like that, and this is the work surface. It's that simple. I do have a metal plate somewhere with a hole punched in it that goes on here like a collar, so when it gets down to, like, say this point, it actually will stop going into the ground, because otherwise you just lose it and then you have to dig it out and start over, and that's a real pain in the butt. You can also stick them in stumps, but a lot of times they'll just keep getting deeper and deeper until they get stuck or split the log in half. This is the book I was talking about. I found it, Practical Blacksmithing. It's actually a compilation of different articles and stuff, probably compiled from magazines and periodicals. Those used to be a big deal. It's one of the ways that craftsmen and farmers and stuff communicated is they would have these periodicals, and they would write in to the editor and get their stuff published in there. People would take that material and turn it into books, so this is basically one of those. So let's see what this guy has to say. Sharp or round edges for anvils. And the question is posed here. Would an anvil of any make be more convenient if both edges of its face were to be rounded for 1/3 or 1/2 of its length? And here's the answer. It is not my desire at this time to discuss the relative merits of different makes of anvils. What I would like to know is whether in any anvil there is any reason for having the edges that are represented by the lines AB, that's this section right here, sharp instead of rounded to a curve of 1/4 of an inch or more in radius. I believe that it is impossible to forge an interior angle sharp and have the forging round. So what he's trying to say here is that if you have a sharp edge here and you bend a piece of metal over it, it's going to make a sharp curve in here, a sharp bend, and it's almost like that was going to cut into the metal. And he's basically making the argument that that essentially weakens this corner and damages the metal. And anything you do from there to round that off or make it different just doesn't matter, because you've already cut it. It does not matter how small the work, nor how insignificant the shoulder that is formed by the re-entering angle. If sharp in the corner, the structure of the iron at that point is destroyed and the forging weakened. The weakness may not at first be apparent. The forging may look well enough, for it is only in exaggerated cases that the crack or cut is actually found. Now, if it be a fact that the sharp inside corners in the work cannot be made safely, which I agree with, by the way, what possible use can there be for sharp outside edges on the anvil? True, I have seen blacksmiths cut off excess stock over the edge of the anvil when their hardy was duller than the anvil, but who will defend them in such an operation? So what he's saying is that this tool right here that goes in that square hole is for cutting off iron, and he's saying that, you know, if this is really damaged or someone doesn't have one, they might use the edge of their anvil as a surface to cut on, like a chisel. For my own part, I am satisfied not only that the sharp edges are useless, but that they are also destructive of good work. I cannot account for their existence except as a relic of a time when the principles of forging were but little understood. I want both edges of my anvil rounded, not simply for a part of their length, but for the whole length. To my mind, the ideal anvil of 130 pounds is one having its edges from A to B rounded to a curve of 3/8 of an inch radius. That's here, which is about what mine looks like, is probably 3/8. And its edges from B to C rounded to a curve of 3/16 or 1/4 of an inch. That's this right here, second part. So he's saying 3/8 here, 1/4 or 3/16 there. The edge from E to F can be left sharp to satisfy the unconverted. That's here, right here. Well, he converted me. If I wanted one, I would leave a very, very small radius right here, but not a sharp one even, you know, like somewhat rounded off at least. And like I said, I kind of feel like the ideal solution might be going from about 3/8 here and tapering continually all the way down to here, where it's maybe like even a 1/16 of an inch rounded. And that would leave this part well protected because it's more rounded, and it would give you lots of different options for different radiuses of bends you might want to make in the stock. Once you get above that, you know, look at this. This is a tool that's really nice to have. I made this out of an axle, like a truck axle. Real easy to make. And, you know, here you have everything from 3/8 or even smaller and just growing bigger as you go down. And then you get to the horn, and this is about 3/4 and bigger from there. There's also this. I made this one here out of a piece of tool steel, and that's a Holdfast. Pretty neat tool. You can, like, let's say I wanted to hold this down. I just put this here, and this is tempered like it's tempered like a spring. It needs to be steel. It needs to be tool steel. And then you just tap this down, and it holds the work for you. You can get it pretty tight. And then when you want to take it out, pop it like that. Pretty cool. Fun tools. I get my shop set up again someday here.